Money Talks. I'm Genevieve Westcott with your latest financial news from across New Zealand and around the world. In this edition, how come Germany can't sell its bonds? And what's it mean for Europe and the deepening debt crisis? The UN warns big changes are needed to feed the world with a quarter of the globe's farmland highly degraded. And who's got it and who doesn't? We bring you the highs and lows from the very latest regional economic scoreboard for God's own. And joining me now to talk more about that, the scoreboard, how it works, what it means, is ASB Chief Economist Nick Tuffley. Hot off the press, Nick, you're just releasing this information today.
Yes, it is. It's just going out today. So it's a compilation of all the economic activity that's happened over the third quarter. So we're looking back a little bit to get a bit of a snapshot of how the various regions have fared.
And how are we looking? Let's start first of all with the national picture. How are we doing? Let's look at employment. You give it a fair to middling.
Well, we have started to see employment gather a bit of steam. So over this year it has actually picked up more noticeably compared to last year, but we still have employment relatively high, so 6.6% really hasn't come down that much from the peak.
Wages apparently need an energy injection. Tell me about that.
Yes, wage growth is still relatively weak, and that reflects some of the austerity that we went through during the recession. But as we see the employment market start to improve, more and more skill shortages pick up, you tend to find that wages will start to follow up.
And house prices and sales, how are they doing?
Not too bad. We've seen generally a bit of a lift in house sales. They are still relatively low, but we have started to see prices starting to edge up this year after a pretty soft patch at the end of last year.
We're coming into Christmas, of course, and everybody's thinking about buying gifts for, the in-laws and the kids and the dogs. How's retail spending doing on a national picture?
It's doing all right. Even though we had the World Cup in there distorting the figures a little bit, as everybody spent a lot of money on beer, there's still actually a reasonable underlying momentum. So we've seen the signs that retail spending is picking up a little bit. It's still a fairly gradual pace, but it has been improving.
And of course, construction, you pick it as being sad. How sad? How bad is it, Nick?
Look, it is pretty weak. We are down about a third from the peak of a few years ago. We're still not quite into that stage where Canterbury and particularly Christchurch is being rebuilt. So we will see construction start to charge up next year, but right here, right now, it's still at pretty low levels.
Okay, when you look across at all the regions, who's top of the pops?
Well, Auckland at the moment still hanging in there at the top. I think that really reflects the fact that it's a part of the country where mortgages tend to be quite high, so it's probably enjoying those low interest rates. We are seeing employment growth and retail sales fairly strong in the region, and it does tend to benefit from fairly strong population growth as well.
Now, interestingly, I see that Southland is really moving up the ranks. Tell me about that.
Yes, Southland was relatively low until fairly recently, but really starting to charge up. Now with Southland, I think it's probably an example of where that rural story is starting to emerge. It's very, very dependent on the rural areas, and we've had such a good run on the rural side on prices, and I think we're starting to see some of that confidence starting to be reflected in Southland, and some of the signs that the money is just starting to come out and be spent on the farms and around the region.
And apparently consumer confidence is the highest of anywhere in the country. Go figure.
Yes, charged up. So I think down south, quietly confident, and some of the benefits of the commodity boom are starting to come through.
How's the Waikato doing? Of course, that's a white gold territory with all that dairy. I would assume it would be just going gangbusters, but not so.
Not yet. I guess we'd say it's beavering along at the moment, but we're not quite seeing the same sort of signs that we're seeing in Southland, where some of that money's starting to come out and be spent. But I think that's a story of over time in a lot of those areas that have been quite dependent on the rural sector. We'll start to see some of that money gradually being spent as farmers get a little bit more confidence over time and their financials start to get back into order.
Let's talk a little bit now about the New Zealand dollar generally. How are we doing with all the chaos in Europe? And we'll talk about that in depth when we come back with Murray Weatherston.
Well, for us, as this crisis continues to keep on going, we tend to find that our currency is weakening. So that's that age-old story of the money goes and hides in the US whenever people are worried, and that drags our currency down against the US. So in some ways, that's a good buffer for us. When times do look a little bit more precarious globally, our currency weakening does help provide us a bit of insulation.
And how are we tracking against the pound right now?
We have been easing off a little bit, so we were around that 50 level that we were at. We've been easing off 49, 48 a little bit. So we have found that we've been underperforming slightly against the euro, also the pound during this time, despite the fact that they're a bit closer to the action, as you could say.
And agricultural commodities, how do we do in the last 7 days?
Well, I think we're holding up reasonably well on that front. I think generally looking back at what prices have been doing, they've actually been pretty resilient during this time where there's been a lot more chaos and volatility on markets. So that's mildly encouraging for us.
And let's hope it continues.
Yes.
Thank you, Nick. Coming up after the break, win some, lose some, the agony and the ecstasy of the latest election, and what the politicians now have planned for the economy. It probably won't be pretty. Our timber industry is in big trouble. And global go-to information. What's the latest in Europe? And how are the world markets managing? But first, if Phil Goff had won the election, he would have appointed a Minister for Rural Affairs. His plan was backed by Rural Women New Zealand, among others, which believes that the rural communities are often overlooked and even marginalized. So answer this in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. What percentage of New Zealand's rural population actually works in agriculture? The answer when we come back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, what percentage of New Zealand's rural population works in agriculture? 14%. That's right, just 14% of our country neighbors actually work in the business. It's dire times for our timber industry and the New Zealand wood processors. Joining us now to talk about this and plenty more is the former chief economist for the BNZ and currently director of Financial Focus, Murray Weatherston. And Murray, logs are up, lumber is down. What's going on?
That's right. Well, the domestic timber industries had a real tough time. The Timber Industry Federation just put out a news release that showed that exports are well down, and as Nick was talking about in the first half, because the construction sector in New Zealand is down, we're not building very many houses, the demand for lumber or timber, which is just processed wood, is way down, so they're having a real tough time. At the same time, log exports are up pretty high, quite a lot. And that really shows the problem that New Zealand has. We're trying to convert the country to have more value added in our exports, but the rest of the world would sooner import our raw materials from us and process it in their own country. So, it's a headwind.
Yeah, apparently we were going to have a kind of a wall of wood, if you like, Nick, where we would, process all the wood here and we would sell it to the world. That ain't happening. Isn't this just a fact of global life now going forward? We always talk about adding value. The world doesn't always want it.
I think the challenge is that there are some industries where other countries can do what we would like to do more efficiently, and I think China's probably an example where they're able to build mills on huge scale, large modern ones, and their cost of processing can be a lot lower, and that is a challenge that you do find trying to add value in areas like that.
Let's talk about the New Zealand election now. Of course, John Key went back in a big way. Your take on the results?
Well, I mean, the centre-right got just over 50% of the votes, and they're going to form the government. I think there were some clear winners, including Mr Key and the National Party. I think Winston Peters was a big winner, and I think the other winner was the Green Party. One of those three is in government, and the other two are in opposition for the next 3 years. The turnout was pretty low, and it may really reflect that there really weren't any big issues that people got really excited about, and therefore they stayed at home.
What do you think, Nick? What was your take on the election? Any surprises there for you?
Oh, probably the surprise that a lot of people had on the night was that question mark over whether Winston Peters would get over the threshold or not.
And he got well over the threshold, going back, storming down the beehive doors.
Yes, so he did. So the polls were anywhere between, say, 3 or 5% beforehand. So always, I think, tough to call those when polls can be out by 1% or so, exactly where someone's going to sit when they're so close to the threshold.
How did the financial markets react?
Well, the dollar actually went up about 1 cent on the morning. Now, that was partly due to some news about Europe, but it would have been partly down to the election. And I think the key thing for markets is they don't like uncertainty, and what you had was a pretty clear signal that there would be a government really able to form, and that takes away that uncertainty factor, and markets know the government will get on with life.
Well, John Key and the boys have certainly promised a lot that we'll be back into a surplus budget, by 2014-15 at the latest. The reality now is they have to make it happen. What do you think they're going to do first of all?
Well, I think it's going to be pretty much business as usual. I mean, they really are the sitting government. It's the same coalition that's going to come forward. They will move on the partial sale of the assets.
Yes, apparently maybe Genesis could be the first one
right.
up on the chopping block.
Yeah, but it's much later than most people expected. I think a lot of people thought that those sales would all happen, next year. It sounds pretty much like the first one might happen towards the end of 2012, but the rest of them will be 2013, 2014. With respect to closing the deficit, the government deficit by selling assets, I really think it's about time we had some government accounts that separated out what you'd call current expenditures and capital expenditures. Now, sale of your assets is actually not ongoing revenue. You sell them and you only get the money once.
That's right, it's gone.
And I'd actually like to see the government start to put out a set of accounts that was more like a business set of accounts where it was revenue and expenditure, or current revenue and expenditure, and then all the capital items separately.
Murray, is it going to be business as usual, or is it going to have to be tougher business? New Zealand Herald did a mood of the boardroom survey, and all of the big CEOs around the country basically said John Key has to be a heck of a lot tougher. For example, one of the things they talked about was conservation mining. Remember Jerry Brownlee? We were going to mine in conservation areas, and Key didn't have the stomach to go with it. Is he going to have to get a lot tougher now?
Well, they'll have to think about that. But the thing for New Zealand in general is that we do have choices, and we have to make them. We have to figure out where our priorities lie. And we did see last time there were a lot of people who prefer to keep the environment pristine, even if it might be quite a way out of sight, against the benefits of mining. So look, as a society, we have to make those decisions, and we have to live with the consequences, positive or negative.
I'll tell you who I wouldn't want to be right now, and that's a public servant living in Wellington. I think the axe is going to come down fairly hard and fairly soon.
Well, we have seen the government working very, very hard to get more efficiency out of the public sector, and I think that's likely to continue. We did have huge growth in the public sector for quite a period of time, and this is a time where the government is really trying to keep its expenditure growth to the bare minimum. So they will be looking quite hard at getting the most out of how they're spending the money. And
still no movement, no real movement in Canterbury. How much longer can they afford to wait?
Well, they're going to have to wait until they can figure out where they can rebuild. I mean, I think one of the problems with Canterbury has been they sort of promised that things would happen quickly, and I think it's going to be much, much slower. It may not be next year when it starts to happen. It may not be the year after. I think the rebuilding of Christchurch is more like a 25-year program than a 2 or 3 year program.
So really, we have to be realistic, don't we? I mean, we've been promised the earth, but now we got to deliver.
That's right. And I think the thing with John Key is he's not really an aggressive policy maker. I put him much more in the populist camp rather than being a reformer. He really hasn't come in with a program that says we're going to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and we're going to get on, and that's the recipe for it. I mean, I actually always find it difficult when I sit down to try to think about what he actually stands for. He's more incremental, and he's
That's
more
right, conservative, incremental growth, and let's hope that very slowly and calmly things will sort. I don't know if we've got that time, especially when you look at what's going on in Europe. News out of the Financial Times today that the Eurozone could break up within 10 to 12 days. What are you hearing, Nick?
Well, not really too much speculation that the euro will break up that quickly. There has been a lot more focus this week on what's happening in Europe in terms of there's a lot more focus on coming up with plans to partially guarantee government's debt. And at least at the moment, markets seem to be a little bit more settled this week anyway, with that sort of talk going on. But with the Europeans, the proof is always in the pudding. You've got to wait until they've actually finished cooking up what they're doing to see whether it actually will fly.
I think the scariest thing that I heard about recently was Germany trying to sell its bonds. Only 60% were taken up. Nobody wants them. What's that say to us?
Well, I mean, it's a bit hard to know why the other 40% wasn't taken up. It's not like Germany tried to raise the money and people would only lend it to them at 10%. The interest rate was 2% or thereabouts. I have read on the blogs a conspiracy that suggested that the world financial markets are trying to teach Germany a lesson, because the world financial markets really want Germany to fall into line and to bail out the other countries, which will actually help to bail out some of the banks with some of their sovereign debt loans. But I personally don't think Germany not being able to raise the money was a big deal. It's a much bigger deal if Italy's got facing 7-8% interest costs on its loans.
Yeah. Belgium was downgraded as well in recent days.
Yeah.
What does that tell us?
Well, they are under a bit of pressure themselves. I mean, they do actually have a pretty good credit rating. It's still AA. But Belgium's trying to bail out Dexia, one of the banks that operates in Belgium, Luxembourg and France. So they've been coming under pressure to come up with the money for that. Look, just on government debt, I think with Germany, they have failed to fill bond auctions before. I think they're probably just pretty hard-nosed on the price they get, but happening at a time when other countries have been having difficulties raising money didn't really send a great signal. We have actually seen German bond yields lifting up, even as UK and US bond yields have been going down, and they're arguably got bigger financial issues than what Germany has.
Yeah, but that was really last week's story with the American share market down as a result of that. This week, the American share market's up. There's meetings happening in Europe, I think December the 8th, and then there's
December
another...
the 9th, they next meet. The EU leaders meet in Brussels.
And then there's another meeting on the 17th of 18th of December. I just think they're going to go from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting. And the chances of the euro, falling apart within the next 10 or 12 days, I would think that's just sheer fantasy.
Slim and none, and Slim's in Alberta, as they say where I come from. Yeah. Speaking of the American markets, fascinating to see how much those Americans were spending for the Thanksgiving holidays. They have Black Friday. They also have Cyber Monday.
Yeah.
We don't have any money apparently in North America, but they're all out buying up everything.
The thing that we don't get the sense of is how much of the stuff was actually a bargain, right? So if just imagine in New Zealand, if we were to have all shops were to say 10% off everything, I think on those days the turnover would be extremely high. And the thing, as far as the retailers are concerned, while they may get cash through the till and they may convert some of their stock into money, they may not have made very much profit on the trading whatsoever. So it just depends on what the pricing.
Well, 226 million Americans were there buying either in real stores or online. That is phenomenal.
That's right. But isn't there an expectation that Black Friday is the biggest retail day of the year?
Yeah, but it's never been so bad in the States as it has been for the last, 2-3 years? It's like the message doesn't cut through to the people. And let's talk about some of the poorer people in the world, those that are starving. UN's come out with a new report now saying that it's a quarter of all of the farmland in the world is highly degraded because of the way it's being farmed. That's a problem, isn't it?
Well, as the population grows, we know there are lots of places around the world where we're not using the land effectively, and Africa would be a prime example where there's a lot more scope to be using farmland more effectively. And that's the thing is that we do actually have quite good farm productivity globally, but there are lots of places where it's just not really being applied at all.
By 2050, we're going to have to feed 9 billion people. We're going to have to grow 70% more food. Is it doable?
I would think so.
You are such an optimist.
Well, I mean, if you go back a long time, the Malthusians, wasn't it, that suggested the world wouldn't be able to feed its population in whatever year that, was it the 1700s or the 1600s or the 1800s. The market, does tend to actually come up with a solution, and I'd be surprised if there's more people, a bigger percentage of the population hungry in 2050 than what there is now.
I'll be tracking you down in 2050. You may have to eat those words. I hope not. Thanks. Coming up after the break, Future Proof on the highways and byways of the economic world. Lock and load as our experts take us along for the ride and point out what they'll be watching over the coming week. As we heard earlier, we've suffered substantial timber industry export losses in the past 4 months. So answer this in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. Just how many millions of dollars have we lost in the timber industry exports since July? Find out after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how many millions of dollars have we lost in timber industry exports since July? 70 million. Now it's time for Future Proof. And Nick, what are you going to be watching over the next week?
Over the next week, there's the ongoing European saga to keep an eye on for one thing. That's always things that are driving markets a lot from day to day. I think next week on Tuesday afternoon, the Reserve Bank of Australia is meeting, so there's a lot of speculation about whether they'll cut interest rates again, and a 25-point cut is by and large priced in. It'll probably be touch and go, but there's a lot of speculation in Australia that rates will get cut over the next year, and that's coming through there.
What about our own rates, the OCR here, or what are you picking?
With Thursday week, we think the cash rate's on hold probably till the end of next year now. So really with the European situation looking like it's just taking a long time to get resolved, and the uncertainty that it's continuing to cause, we think that it's really unlikely rates will be going up any time in the first half of next year. So late next year looks best guess at the moment.
What worries you most when you keep your eye on Europe? Where are you really focused?
Italy is probably the big one. Now, Italy did manage to have a pretty successful bond auction overnight, but it will be touch and go. If they get into problems down the track where they can't raise money, that's where you start having the problems. And it's also Germany as well. They are the ones who are really pushing very, very hard back, putting a lot of pressure on countries to reform themselves. They're taking a pretty hard line about any further support, particularly from the European Central Bank, which is about the only thing that could really step up now. So I think Germany's got to be careful they just don't push too hard and push the ambulance from the top of the cliff down to the bottom.
Now, how about you, Mr. Murray Weatherston? What are you going to be watching over the next week?
Well, I think the cricket test in Brisbane will be the first thing. But like Nick, it's really just watching what happens in Europe to see whether they actually do get a breakthrough or not. I'm not expecting one anytime soon. I think the Germans are going to be very hard to get across the line. I think they're going to want to hold the feet of the Greeks and the Spanish and the Italians, the Portuguese. All into the hold their feet to the fire, and they'll be very, very reluctant to use their fiscal power to actually bail them all out. Here
at home, of course, the Labour Party is in tatters, as we know. Who looks good to you?
Well, I mean, the quote that I like the best of, there's 3 Davids and no Goliath.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the difficulties they've got is if they could easily factionalise over this, and I suspect the campaign, there'll be some winners, and there'll be one winner out of it, and there could be several with pretty dented egos as a result of it.
I guess the only reality is it couldn't get much worse, could it? They seem to be at rock bottom now.
Well, they could be the ACT Party, because they really are at rock bottom in my view. But I think Labor will take some time. It may be that they don't really reform themselves sufficiently to even be a decent contender at the next election.
What are the lessons, do you think, that the Labour Party now have to take to heart after the absolute trouncing they got from the voters?
Well, I think there's that need to do reflection and figure out why they think they did how they did. And I think if they gave themselves more time to pick a leader and did that work first, it probably gives them a bit of a steer on what will be the most appropriate leader to take themselves forward. But
yeah,
it does require time.
Yeah, and it's almost like they were all waiting in the wings. I don't think they really supported Phil Goff during the Labour campaign, I got to be honest. It's like they were all just waiting for the inevitable to happen, and now they're rushing to come up with a new leader. I think they're moving pretty quick.
Well, it's one of those times where going back and having a look probably does pay out, because you want to figure out who's the best leader to take you forward, and I think you also need to know which direction you're going in as well. So I'm not a politician, but that's probably how I would look at it from my personal point of view.
Actually, I think their leadership problem has actually been created by Phil Goff's and Annette King's wish to get out before Christmas. If they had been prepared to stay on, perhaps till February, the thing might have worked itself out a bit better. But it's clear they didn't have the stomach to stay around any longer. It was clear Labor was never going to win the election. I think anybody who bet money that Labor would win the election, was a fool, frankly, because the polls were all grossly against them. Yeah. And no contender was prepared to stand up to try to topple Goff, because they thought they were going to get the same result.
In 30 seconds or less, how big a problem is Winnie Peters going to be for John Key?
I think he'll be the biggest thorn in Key's side. and he'll probably be, for the first part, the effective opposition in Parliament.
Watch this space. Nick, your take on it?
Well, I'm just going to be watching like anybody else.
You're staying out of it.
I'm staying out of it.
Yeah, okay, all right. We'll talk later privately. Thanks to my guests, Murray Weatherston and Nick Tuffley. Be sure to check out our website for all kinds of must-know info and great programming. Meantime, wasn't it Albert Einstein who once said, "Life is like riding a bicycle? To keep your balance, you must keep moving." Keep the faith. See you next time.